your service. I'm a big fan of our veterans and have had a great experience working with some really dynamic veteran exporters. Uh, Curtis did me the favor of allowing me to come on really for two purposes to kick off this presentation from Margaret. Uh, First of all, we have uh, a webinar, an SBA webinar, SBA support for veteran-owned businesses that we're doing with the VA in January. So this is in part an invitation and introduction to that, but also, and probably more importantly, just to help make people aware of some of the resources that are out there, because I know Margaret's going to talk about some issues that are relatively complicated if you don't have experience in that area. And a lot of times we want folks to know there's help out there for these types of things. And the stuff I'm gonna talk about briefly today as an intro to our office isn't so much directly related to international government or contracting opportunities, but it's related to international trade and promoting exports. And so I think it's relevant uh, to this issue as well. So I again represent the Small Business Administration, but the Office of International Trade, which is an office that I think a lot of people aren't aware SBA has. Uh, those folks who are used to SBA and kind of knowing what SBA does, we're sort of a kind of a growth wing of SBA, I like to say. So we're there to kind of help businesses take that next step to grow their business to foreign markets. And our office has kind of three areas that we focus on: primarily export counseling and technical assistance, which is like I have a website down there for trade tools, which is a place you can go to get some kind of initial orientation on doing business internationally. And then the email address there, international@sba.gov, is kind of a help desk answer line, typically used by businesses that are engaged in international trade and they're coming up with against barriers, or they face a challenge that they're not really sure what to do about. So our folks there that monitor that line will often connect businesses to, if it's not SBA that can help them, there's so many other federal agencies that provide services to kind of support our U.S. businesses going overseas. So they can connect you to the right folks. And then we have our grant and trade finance solutions, which I'll talk a little bit more of in this introduction. And then finally, the division of our office focuses on access to foreign markets and trade policy, and making sure that the voice of small business is heard in those types of negotiations. So in terms of the grant solutions, because everybody likes to hear about free money available out there. And this is a fantastic program, the State Trade Expansion Program, and this can definitely support some of the things that you want to do in the international contracting arena. But it's about $20 million that gets funneled out through SBA to most of the states and territories. Not everybody participates, but it's kind of a matching grant for federal and state, where if the state puts some money towards supporting small businesses going overseas, the federal government comes in through the STEP program with a 3-to-1 match in most cases to that money. So uh, the STEP grant can help cover participation in trade missions, uh, using services from the U.S. Department of Commerce, like the Gold Key service, which is a fantastic service they offer, where their embassies overseas will set up appointments for you with potential distributors or partners in foreign markets. And then website development, that's the kind of the globalization of websites was a big thing during COVID when folks stopped traveling, and just the kind of the global e-commerce abilities that can be supported through a STEP grant can really jumpstart the international market for businesses. And then you have marketing materials, trade shows, different kinds of export training, even trade missions in the U.S. with foreign companies that come to the U.S. to visit, counseling services, and then trade credit insurance programs like the XM export credit insurance, for instance, that protects you from non-payment and things like that when you're doing a business overseas to make it easier for you to do those things. So I put the website down there. I on the slide I put $1 in STEP grant equals about $43 in export sales. I think that's generally what they have on return on investment. So the money that we're putting in to support the participation of small businesses overseas results in $43 in export sales for every dollar we put in. So the sba.gov/step for that one. I want to mention our trade finance programs as well, that SBA comes in and offers a 90% guarantee to banks to support small businesses in the export arena in 3 different programs. And I'm not going to go into the specifics of the programs, but 2 of them are more working capital related. And then the international trade loan is more about investment in plant and equipment to grow production capacity so you can sell overseas. And again, these are things that we're going to talk about. I think I missed a slide somehow. I lost a slide in here, Curtis. I don't know what happened to my slide with the QR code for the January 16th webinar, but I'm sure Curtis will be able to get that out to folks so that you can sign up, and we'll cover much more than what we do. We'll cover Boots to Business, and which is kind of a kickstart for veterans to start businesses and grow, and some of the other resources that are available from SBA. So again, the point of me being here is to say, hey, Margaret may talk about some stuff that seems a little bit intimidating if you haven't done it before, but there's folks like us that are here to help. And as the federal government wants you to succeed in all your endeavors, particularly growing sales outside the country, because that's good for the whole economy. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Margaret, and thanks for letting me jump on.
I don't know what happened myself, Steven. Sorry, Margaret, but I will send you guys the actual slide with the QR code. I'm gonna make sure that it's in the packet when I send out the presentation. I think you're on mute, Margaret. Go ahead.
And that's January 16th at 2 p.m. So I just want to highlight that. So noted, but Curtis, we'll get that out to you. But thank you, Curtis, for having me here, to the VA for having me here. Stephen, thank you so much for that part of your presentation. I really appreciate it. Before I get started, some of you were here a couple months ago when we were doing this presentation on working internationally. And for those of you who weren't, I dropped off halfway through because I was having a little bit of a medical situation, and I just was not physically able to continue. The doctors took great care of me. I am fine. I'm robust. I'm back in the game. And Curtis was kind enough to welcome me back. And I thank all of you who sent me. I'm getting that there's no sound. Curtis and Stephen, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. If you're unable
Okay.
to hear Margaret or hear us, try either switching your browser or try switching your audio. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Olivia. Anyway, thanks to you all who reached out to me with well wishes and prayers. I appreciate it. And I'm glad to be back here and glad to be healthy. So I'm going to cover working internationally as a federal government contractor to give you some things to go over. Starting, picking up where Stephen left off, I'm going to go off my camera as well. I'm picking up where Stephen left off. The U.S. government does have resources to help you. The SBA would be a wonderful place to go. As Stephen explained, they have great resources. But there are other resources to go. If you're already in a country or you aspire to go into a particular country, contact the U.S. Embassy there on the ground. They're always very helpful to to not only small businesses, but any business in country. And it's just a great relationship to make. They're very welcoming. They've got economic teams on the ground to help US businesses get into the country, wherever that is. The US International Trade Administration, and here's a hyperlink for them. They're great as well. They oftentimes put on webinars around like sort of almost a virtual trade show. Think about it. They're doing one upcoming on Vietnam, how to go to market in Vietnam as a defense contract. And those people are very approachable, provide tons of information as well. I'm going to cover the export regulations. That's EAR, Export Administration Regulations. It's the Department of Commerce that manages those and oversees those and implements those regulations and makes sure that everybody's following them. That is their job and their duty, but they also have a great website with tons of tools and information on how to follow those regulations. If you're selling something defense or military oriented, it's controlled by the US Department of State under the International Traffic in Arms Regulations. And they too have tons of information up on their website that is useful to those trying to figure out how things work. And then finally, the US Department of Treasury, Office of Foreign Asset Control, is the agency responsible for sanctions, for sanctioning other countries or persons or businesses, which we're going to talk a little bit more about. So just picking up on Stephen's theme, I am going to cover a lot of regulatory details, and it will seem overwhelming possibly to some of you. Some days it's overwhelming to me, but there are resources for this, and Stephen's organization would be great. And then the VA is always here to help as well. So moving on, I'm bucketing this into a couple ways that you should think about your legal risks when you're going overseas. Now, remember, I'm a lawyer, so I can't tell you how to go to business overseas. But what I can tell you is once you're going over to business overseas, outside of the country of the United States, what are some things that you need to be aware of? You need to be aware around the exporting rules. You need to be aware of rules around corruption that could vary, distinguish or detailed and stringent. And then something that in the business, if you will, is called know your customer. Know who you're selling to, because there's a lot of ramifications for what happens when you don't know who your customer is. And we'll talk about that a little bit. And then I'm going to give you some ideas at a really high level of how you can manage some of these risks. But just knowing that they're out there is the beginning, because then you know to ask someone, Stephen, VA, the other agencies, lawyers or somebody to help you through, as long as you can identify it. Okay, so what do your contracts say? If you're already a government contractor or you plan on becoming a government contractor, what do your contracts say when it comes to you guys working internationally? Well, first off, they say you can't violate US sanctions. And nowadays, when I talk about sanctions, people sort of know a little bit more what I mean. You read in the news about Russia was sanctioned for this or Russia was sanctioned for that. We're going to cover it more, but it's essentially prohibitions on who we as US persons can do business with. Your contracts also tell you to comply with the export laws. They don't tell you how to do it, but they just say you better do it. And then depending on what sort of work you're doing, you have to understand and manage your foreign involvement. There's some contracts that cannot be performed overseas or that cannot have any sort of non-US involvement. And then, of course, you got to be no corruption, and you got to be a responsible, good government contractor. Okay, so I'm going to give a review over exporting. So why do we even control exports here in the United States? And side note, you guys, we control exports here in the United States, something that's leaving our country, but don't forget other nations do as well. So if you're going to export something into Japan, and now there it is in Japan, you've got to remember that Japan now will say something about whether you could export that item out of Japan. So you got to always pay nod and honor the laws and the regulations of the nation of where you're doing business. Caveat, that changes a little bit if you're working on a US military base, because we oftentimes have status of forces agreements that say it's kind of the US law that applies to the US military base overseas. But that all depends, and the devil's in the detail. So we do it, as do other nations, to protect our national security. We don't want other countries to get information, even if it's in our industrial base, that may expose our national security to risk. We monitor our exports because of our U.S. foreign policy, and then also to protect U.S. innovation. So we don't want things just flying all around the world that, if they end up in the hands of a bad actor, may be detrimental to us as a country, or it may be detrimental to other countries, and in the stability of countries and the world. So that's sort of why we control exports, the main reasons. So what does export mean? You got to think about this in the broadest sense of the word. It means knowing. And when I put parentheses around something as a lawyer, that means that it's a special word because it's defined in the regulations. When a lawyer says knowing, we mean like you knew or you should have known. So sometimes my clients will say to me, well, Margaret, if we don't go determine if our item is export controlled, we never look into that. How would we know then we're exporting something that's controlled? Well, the government would cry foul on you, because you have to know if you're going to export something. But additionally, you can't be willfully blind that you're improperly exporting something. So if you have something and you want to sell it overseas, you got to make sure you know the export classification of that item, and saying, I'm just not going to go discover it and then I won't know if I'm exporting something that I'm not supposed to. That's not going to cut it with the government because of this word knowing. So exporting means shipping or carrying items out of the United States. That's kind of an easy one. We can all think of that. Shipping through a country that is sanctioned. Thank you, Robert. It is model penal code terminology. It's export control terminology too. And then transferring or disclosing information. And that's sort of key. Remember that goods, a hard product thing, can go overseas. That's easy to think about how that's going to go. But software, if you electronically send something overseas, that's still an export. Technology and services can all be exported. So how can an export occur? It can occur orally or visually. So let's say I had an export control software, and it described how to do some sort of intelligence gathering, or it described how one of our US defense systems worked. And I decided to hold a seminar to show how a particular weapon system worked for DoD. And my item is export controlled, but I invite people from around the world to sign up to watch my software and how it works and how this defense weapon system works. Well, we have just improperly exported something by visual means and probably by oral means. So for any of you connected with like the big defense contractors like a Raytheon or Boeing or a place like that, you all protect visual means, oral means, by having certain parts of your facilities walled off, or you can't get to unless you identify yourself as being able and of the right nationality that's allowed to see the materials that are being developed. So you can export something orally or visually. We already talked about electronically. If you send export controlled, let's say you have schematic diagrams of some sort of weapon and you email it to somebody overseas, you've now exported it. Re-exporting means you transfer it to a non-US person and sends it to somebody else. And there's even times that when an export is brought into the United States and it's a non-US product, but now you're going to send it to some other country, it may be considered an export as well. Finally, remember, sometimes services can even be an export. So defense services. So let's say you're going to go over and help train the military of the French military, and you're going to provide them some sort of very military specific training. That is an export for which you need to register and get a license. So when you think export, don't just think about putting something in a box, slapping a label on it, and sending it somewhere overseas. Think about all of these ways: visually sharing information with somebody, orally sharing, electronic means, or otherwise. And so it covers a lot of stuff. So just because you're not physically sharing something, that doesn't mean you're not exporting. So quick hit on this one: the Department of State, also known as DDTC, has the mission to regulate defense services. So if you have defense services, if you have technical data that is related to a defense article, and a defense article is a particular list of things on the US munitions list that are controlled because they are defense related. If you have something of that nature, whether it's a hard thing like night vision goggles, or you have software that explains how a weapon system works, or you're going to train the French on how to use some particular weapon system, all of those things are controlled by ITAR, International Traffic in Arms, on the US munitions list. I got the munitions list up here. Here's the different categories of things that the United States government says are military oriented or defense oriented, and therefore they are controlled by the Department of State because they're on the US munitions list, and you would be violating the International Traffic in Arms if you do not properly register with the Department of State and then make sure that you get an appropriate license to sell something on this list. And you can see the list. There's explosives, there's certain aircraft items, military training equipment, any sort of classified data or information, things related to launch vehicles, guided missiles, ammunition, guns, all of these things, and everything related to them are controlled as a defense article or as a defense item. The next, so that's one bucket of stuff. So like if you have defense related stuff, defense or intelligence community stuff, it's controlled by the International Traffic in Arms. And even before you send it, I'm going to actually go back to my slide because I had it in red and I didn't mention it to you guys. If you are defense items, defense technical data, defense software, defense services, any of those defense type of things or intelligence things, anything on the munitions list, you need to go register with the Department of State that you've got a defense item even before you ever export it. Then you've got to put in controls in your business to make sure that you don't inadvertently export it. Example, you're not using some sort of cloud service for your email where a non-US person may be able to access the defense information. So that's the Department of State, the US munitions list. Moving along, I'll let Curtis jump in with some questions. Okay, Department of Commerce. They regulate what are called, lots of people say, dual use. It has civilian and military applications. But don't let that trick you, because there's some things that you might think are commercial that maybe the US military or defense would never want to look at. Then it may be controlled as well. So that is items that have some sort of innovative capability. It can be used the civilian and the military, and it is controlled by the Department of Commerce. It's the Export Administration Regulations. They control commercial oriented items, technology, information, and software. They do not regulate services. Here's the types of things that they control. Note here, computers. Note here, telecommunications, information security. So if you create a software and it has encryption capabilities to it, it very likely is export controlled. I'm going to stop for one moment and see if I can jump in on some of these questions. Let's see.
I got
probably,
one.
or Curtis, you got something to say?
Yeah, I got one question. I'm looking at it in the Q&A that popped up. It says, for example, with trade or made America items, there are specific regs in the FAR and the DFAR on the CFR on exporting if said item has parts manufactured in multiple countries that are within acceptable countries. However, we later find out the actual raw product came from a sanctioned country. What do we do?
Okay. All right, Olivia, thanks for that question. Here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna hold off on 1 second on that because Olivia, I'm gonna get to the sanctioned part and I'm gonna address your question in the sanctioned part. Um, um, if that's okay. And then I see somebody, Sabrina's asking about a 51% owner of a vet business. Curtis, I'll leave that one to you. And I see Curtis has already responded to that one offline. So thanks, Curtis. But Olivia, great question. Let's jump on and we'll be covering that in moments. So things that are publicly available are not export controlled, but publicly available means it's published out there, general distribution. You can learn about it at open seminars. It's educational, it's information you can get in a library. It's out there for the public to see. Huge caveat to all of you software developers out there. Lots of my clients or other people will say, oh, well, I wrote a software and my software was built using publicly available source and object code from a open source library. That does not get you out of being export controlled. Because if you're using encryption technology and you're putting it into your software, even if the encryption technology you use is open sourced out of an open source library, you still very well likely are export controlled because the US government wants to know where who has encryption technology and where is our encryption technology going to go. So yes, stuff that is export controlled is not export controlled if it's publicly available, but you can't just release it to the public. It's just something that naturally has to be out there in the public. Someone says, I don't know about manure. I'm not going to address that question. But if someone uses lasers in their services, they need to register with the Department of State and Department of Commerce as well. Okay, so Jim, thank you. That's a good question. If you are covered by the Department of State, if the Department of State controls your laser because it's a defense-oriented or intelligence-oriented laser, then you only need to register with the Department of State. You do not have to go to Commerce. It's either one or the other. If State, Department of State, ITAR, U.S. munitions list has your product controlled, then no, you do not need to go to Commerce. Likewise, if your product is controlled by Commerce, you don't need to go to State. So it's really, then you got to drill down on the nature of what your product is. I hope that helps. So that's the short answer. So Olivia asks, so basically all tech. Well, I'm going to answer it like this, Olivia. Tech and technology are defined terms in the ITAR and in the export regulations. So and then it becomes very particular to what sort of tech it is. So there's certain technologies that are not export controlled, depending on what the nature of that technology is. You need to, and I'll show you in a moment, you need to go down those lists that I showed you, find out where your tech may fall. Does your tech fall under the rubric of a gun or a weapon? Then probably that tech is controlled. But if your tech is somehow related how to build an office chair, then that type of tech may not be export controlled. Okay, so deemed export, this is an export as well. If you're a US company, if you're a US company and you're working here in the United States and you have, encryption software that is export controlled and you're here in the United States, it's not US munitions list, it's not defense, but it's just encryption under the export administration regulations. And you now start hiring non-US persons to access your technology, help build your software, or otherwise engage in exposure to visually, orally, or however, to something that's export controlled. Even if that person is here in the United States, it is still considered an export. So what this means is you need to be careful on, if you have export controlled stuff, just like if you're a contractor, defense contractor, where you have classified contracts, you have to be very careful on who you hire because you may need to get an export license for your own employees. Thanks, Olivia, for the confirm. Okay, so let's see. I like that, Olivia. Yes, you got to make sure you know. You should not assume. Thank you, Olivia. So if open source tech with no encryption is involved, there's no problem with an export controlled. James, I cannot possibly answer that question because if you look back at my lists that I provided to you, both the export list and the defense oriented list, you can have tech that doesn't have encryption technology, but it's controlled for some other reason. Maybe it's tech related to really cool sonar or really cool radar that has nothing to do with encryption, but it's technology related to sonar or radar. It would still be export controlled. So for export controlled, it all depends on your product. And I'm going to go into that in a moment. So we already covered software, something that's called mass market. James, if it's AI, same response, but that's a great question. If it's AI, it may be controlled under the export regulations as some sort of like machine learning or some sort of technology that is controlled as an export. So again, you need to go and check the regulations, and you need to go I cannot tell you how detailed of an analysis can be. If you go to these either Department of Commerce or Department of State websites and click on classify my item, that's what it's called, you'll see how granular the questions will get on trying to decide if something you have is export controlled or not. Software, you definitely need to, as Olivia noted, you need to classify your software against the regulations because it depends on what it does and what its characteristics are around encryption. And we talked about open source libraries, something that's mass market. A great mass market example is Office 365, the Office suite of products. That's mass market. You could go and you could buy it at Best Buy, or you could download it off of Amazon. That's mass market. So although it may have some encryption capability, since it's mass market, there's no license to transfer that product office around the world. Okay. Moving on, business proprietary information. Remember, your trade secrets or your customers' lists, things like that, are things that you need to take care of and protect, but it's not because of export control necessarily. Okay, whoops. Oh, let me go back a couple. Okay, so the exporting process, this might answer some of the questions that have been coming in about how does this work. Can heavy transportation be discussed for movement in other nations? Dennis, I'm taking that as, can heavy transportation be exported? Yes, it can be. And again, depending on what the heavy transportation is and what it does and how it works and what are the pieces and parts of that heavy transportation, there may be export controlled aspects to that. So again, you'd have to check the regulations. And I'm going to go through a little bit of the process. So your first question about whatever you have, whether it's technology, whether it's a software, or whether it's hardware or services, the first section you have to ask, question you have to ask yourself is my product, software, goods, or services, is it subject to an export license such that if I'm going to move it into another country, any way that could happen, it needs a license? Or I need a license to move it to another country, but there's some sort of exception to the license? Or is there something, my product is not licensed, does not need a license because it's not export controlled? That's the question you've got to ask yourself. Is my product export controlled by the munitions list or by the export control list out of commerce? If the answer to yes, it's export controlled, then is there an exception where I don't need to get a license? Or is my product such that I don't need a license? If, after you ask yourself, you comply one of three ways. If your product is export controlled, that doesn't mean you can't send it somewhere. We'll get back to Olivia's questions because there are places where you can't send it. It means you've got to get the right license. Sometimes you might be required to get a license, encryption, for example, but there may be an exception. There's an exception to encryption if it's a certain caliber of encryption. If it is kind of general common type of encryption that is often used regularly in software, you will then fall under a license exception. Then there's items that are not controlled by the export. An easy one is a Hershey bar, right? A Hershey bar is never going to be export controlled. So you'll know you don't need a license and you don't need to look for a exception. You're allowed to classify your item. You're allowed to go onto those two websites, look at the regulations, and say, I have a product that does X. I make sonar. Let me go to the section of the munitions list and the commerce control list and see how the regulations describe sonar of when it's controlled and when it's not controlled. So there'll be all sorts of things about it. Is your sonar capable of operating X number of feet below ground? Is your sonar capable of operating X number of feet into the air? Those sorts of things might make it more special, such that it might be controlled by the military. And even if it doesn't do that, it still may be controlled, as may be software related to it, as may be technology related to it. So you've got, that's your start. You go through and determine if your item is controlled or not. License exceptions are based on what is your item, where's your country going, who's your end user, what's the end use. There's also some other exceptions that are very narrow. So for example, there is the temporary export re-export exception. Let's say you have a little tiny, I don't know, something that the Department of the Defense uses. You have a little tiny handheld sonar thing, and it is export controlled, and you think to yourself, gosh, I wonder if I can go show it at a trade show in France. Well, you check the regulations. There may be an exception where you don't need a license to just carry it handheld over to a trade show. So you need to check out whether your product is licensed, and then if it is there some sort of exception that you may fall under? Then remember, your item, once you create a US item, it's export no matter where it is. And so as a US person, once you have an item created in the US, it's of a US origin, or you bring it here to the US to send out of the US, you have to assume that your item needs to be compared against the export control list. The next question you need to answer, and this is going to get to Olivia's question, is you need to then, okay, so now your license, let's say whatever your product is, it's export controlled. The next thing you got to look at, all right, my item is export controlled, but that's not the end of your inquiry. You've got to figure out controlled for which countries. So there's our close allies. Something may be export controlled if you're going to sell it to let me think of somebody, the Kuwaitis, but it may not be export controlled if you're going to sell it to the UK. So something can be export controlled for one country, but not for another country. Obviously our close allies, we have less restrictions around them. Then there's some restrictions for those countries that operate like in the free world, if you will. So like the Argentinians and the Brazilians, there's still export controlled stuff there, but it's less stringent. Then you get into your countries of concern, and then you get into your countries that support terrorism or otherwise sanctioned and embargo. So that gets to Olivia's question. What if your product is from or going to a sanctioned country, which we're going to drill down on in a moment? There are certain countries, I have them called OFAC countries. That's the Office of Foreign Asset Control, that handles sanctions for the United States. And the Office of Foreign Asset Control, working with other agencies and the President of the United States, decides what countries should be sanctioned. So for example, Iran and North Korea, those are easy to conceptualize. We got sanctions against those countries. You're not going to be able to get a license to sell most things into Iran or North Korea. Almost nothing can go into those countries, even if you like say, oh, let me see if I can get a license. No, because it's sanctioned, as we cannot do business with them. There's very, very, very rare exceptions, but those are two countries that everybody sort of knows as sanctioned nations. The next, and this is what I'm talking about. This is the commerce country chart. So let's say you went, once you read once you determine how your item or software or technology is classified, at the end of the classification that you make, it's going to give you one of these little numbers like NS1 or NS2. NS means national security or missile technology. So you get the scoop from reading the regulations on classifying your item. Once you classify your item, you'll be able to determine how your item, for what reason is your item export controlled. Is it export controlled for national security? Is it export controlled for missile technology purposes? And here's the list of things that it's export controlled across the top. Then you look at the country where you want to send it. So you could see something, here's Denmark, nuclear proliferation. If your item is controlled because it's related to nuclear stuff, it's not controlled for Denmark, but it is controlled for Costa Rica. So you can see here how the country matters and what your item is that you want to export. They go hand in hand. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I think there were, those were the questions around that. That's kind of how it works. Very devil in the details, people. So go look on the website and you'll see the websites have a way to walk through. I'm talking about the website at the Department of Commerce and the Department of State that control regulations around export. They give you like sort of like a decision tree to help determine if your item is export controlled. Lots of times you'll find that those decisions trees can be very hard, even though those agencies tried to help us. I myself, as a lawyer, I struggle with those decision trees sometimes. Sometimes you need an engineer who's experienced in export controlled and in your item to help you figure it out. And the other thing you can do is you can always go ask the Department of State or the Department of Commerce, is my item export controlled? It's a commodity jurisdiction request that you can make. You can apply to both of those agencies and say, can you please advise on whether my item is export controlled, whether my software is, whether my soft services or technology? You've got to turn in a big application and answer a whole series of questions about your item that will help the Department of State or Department of Commerce give you a conclusion. But remember, you can do that. It takes them time to get through that. So you can't do it like expect an answer overnight. Okay, I'm moving into another area of risk, and that can occur overseas, corruption. Olivia, I think she's cracking a joke. A commodity what? A commodity jurisdiction request. A commodity jurisdiction request is when you go to the agency and say, I got this software, I got this product, I got this technology, or I got these services. Department of State, I want you to review it and tell me whether it's export controlled, or Department of Commerce, I want you to tell me, or you need to go to both. That's a time when you're asking the question whether your item is export controlled, then you do know to go to both agencies unless you know for sure it's not a defense item. That's what it is, Olivia, a commodity jurisdiction request to the agency. Okay, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. I can go through this. This is much more realistic and something that sits with all of us in a much more familiar, common sense way. When you're doing business overseas, this is not saying we in the US are perfect, but there's countries in the world where they have less rule of law than we do. So there's a little bit more activity around bribes and corruptions going on in those countries. And if you Google countries with a lot of corruption, a list will come up. There's actually entities that rank the countries. So for example, there's quite a bit of corruption going on in China. There's a lot of corruption going on in Russia, and certain nations are just sort of known that there's going to be some corruption going on. The US government says to us as US businesses, I don't care where you do business. If you go into another country and in the course of doing business in that other country, you engage in corrupt behavior to either get business, to keep business, or to get some sort of government thing done, then you are still guilty of corruption here in the United States. So said another way, you can't go to another country where they're prone to engage in corrupt behavior or bribes, or you've got to pay off government officials to get your product purchased or to get yourself a business license. Some countries you got to pay a bribe to get a utility service to your facility. There's all sorts of things going on out there in the world. So you can't, as a US business, if you go into another country, and even if that country is very prone to corruption, and that's the only way you're going to get business, or the only way you're going to keep business, or the only way you're going to get a visa, or the only way you're going to get a business license, whatever it is that the government's going to do, and that country does a lot of corruption around it, and you engage in it, you make the corrupt payment to get the business, to keep the business, or to get some sort of government license, or whatever it could be, you have violated a US law called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Said another way, making this simply, you can't go into another country and engage in corruption, even if that's how that country operates, because you're going to violate US law. Here's a hint, a huge hint. You cannot have your third party do what you cannot do. So some countries say, for example, I think Saudi Arabia, if you want to sell to the Saudi Arabian government, no US person can do that. You got to be a Saudi person selling to the Saudi government. So you've got to hire somebody in country in Saudi Arabia who is a Saudi Arabian to sell to the Saudi Arabian government your stuff. If they're looking for a bribe from you, or if they pay a bribe on your behalf, you're responsible for it. So due diligence is so important when you're working globally. Any business partner you're going to work with, any distributor you're going to work with, any place that's going to help you with manufacturing overseas, you've got to do due diligence on those entities and those persons to make sure you've done a little bit of reality check to see if there's anything in their background that would suggest they're oriented toward engaging in corrupt behavior. Because if they engage in corruption on your behalf, you're going to get in trouble for it in the United States. There's that word again, willfully. Ignoring it or burying your head in the sand is not going to win you the day. Failing to do due diligence, the US government says, like, let's say you're going to do business in China, you hire some consultant in China, and unknown to you, the fee you're paying to the Chinese consultant is being used to bribe some Chinese government officials. And now the US government charges you with corrupt activity in China. You can't say, well, I didn't know that my consultant was bribing somebody. The US government is going to say to you, well, you should have known because you didn't do any due diligence. The price that you were paying them to get you business was exorbitant and not market based. The government will build that case against you. And being willfully blind, not paying attention to the risk of somebody doing something corrupt or improper on your part does not help you. Also, success is not required. If you're aware of or you participate in making an illegal payment or an improper payment to get business or keep business or get some sort of government thing done, you're still going to face ramifications of corruption as a charge. So remember, outside of the United States and kind of outside of Western Europe, there's a lot of persons who appear to be a business person, like we would think of them a commercial business person, not related to the government, but they are in fact related to the government. So when you're working and doing business overseas, any non-US government person that works for the government, so somebody who's a governor or legislator in France, they're a government official. But remember, in some countries like China, many of the businesses are what are called state-owned or state-controlled enterprise. Likewise, in China or other countries, the political party is very active in the country. Those are government officials. So paying them or bribing them to do something, you're right back in the same spot. Over in the kingdoms like Saudi, where there are royal families, bribing or influencing the family members of the royal family can also be bribery here in the United States. Okay, this is what I mean by paying attention to your business partners. Who are your business partners? Corruption is one reason. Export controls, and I didn't hit on this previously, is another reason, because let's say you have an export controlled product and it's only allowed to be sold to the French. I think I've got it in here. You have an export controlled product and it's only allowed to be sold to the French. You sell it to some French company, but all of a sudden it ends up in Iran. And this goes back, I think it was Jim maybe who asked us about heavy equipment. This exporter was sentenced to prison for shipping heavy equipment to Iran in violation of US sanctions. Remember, I told you about sanctions. Iran is sanctioned. That means the US government has said, we as US persons, generally speaking, can never do business with Iran or Iran businesses. This exporter went to prison because he shipped heavy equipment to Iran. Now, the way this happens sometimes is you send it to one country and then it all of a sudden ends up in Iran. This is why you have to do due diligence and you know who you're selling to and know who your business partner is. So what this guy did, it was drilling materials. Hajavi was his name. He purchased some drilling materials from a U.S. company, and then as part of a sham transaction, he sold the drill to a United Arab Emirates country, which would have been legitimate. But then he hired other companies, freight forwarders, to export the product from the US to the UAE. And then ultimately, he worked within the United Arab Emirates to get the drilling heavy equipment over to Iran. Now, he's getting in trouble for this, but the US business will likely get in trouble for it too, because there's something called know your customer. And under export control laws, you've got to know where your product goes. You've got to have contracts that say, you're not going to sell my product to somebody else. And you've got to do other things to make sure your stuff doesn't end up somewhere. So just because you sell to a legitimate company in the UAE, and then that company turns around and sells it into Iran or North Korea, you can still be in trouble for it. So you got to know who your third parties are. You got to know who you're doing business with. So who are your, when I say third parties, who is it? It's your customers and your clients, because if you got an export control thing and it's not allowed to go to China or it's not allowed to go to Russia, you have to make sure that it doesn't go to those countries. Your subcontractors, you got to make sure they don't go somewhere either. Your joint venture partners, vendors, distributors, people who are running or building your facilities, your consultants, advisors, any of your third parties, especially in this global environment, you got to know who they are. You got to do some due diligence on them, because if they're out there exporting your stuff where it shouldn't go, selling your stuff into Iran, engaging in corruption, it'll come back to be pinned upon you. So know your customers is also part of the whole sanctions thing. Going back all the way to the beginning to Olivia's question. Olivia's question was, what if you buy a product and it's from a sanctioned nation? You've got to be on the lookout for that. And then once you find out you have some sort of transaction with a sanctioned nation that you should not have had, you have to make a legal decision about what to do about that. But what is the sanction program? The Treasury's Office of Foreign Asset Controls says there are certain countries we cannot do business with, but they also say there are entities we cannot do business with as U.S. persons and persons. So you need to know if you're hiring somebody in, let's say you hire somebody in the Ukraine, you got to make sure that that person is not sanctioned. You've got to do background checks on people and businesses. So I'm not going to go over this, but there's a whole bunch of reasons somebody could be prohibited that we can't do business with, or a country or a person or a business. So you got to check these lists out, and you can go to the Treasury website and put someone's name in there to check out to see whether they or their company are sanctioned, or look at the countries to see if countries are sanctioned. But it's hard. Like, what if you're trying to search the name you have as your consultant in China is John Smith, entering their name into the sanctioned list to see if John Smith of China is in this list? It's very hard to do. If you're doing this globally, you usually need to hire what's called a corporate intelligence or a due diligence firm. Okay, my last 4 minutes, mitigating the risk of these challenges. Start with, do you even need to use a third party overseas? If you have to use one, if there's a business reason you need a third party overseas, document your justification for the third party. Also, do a risk assessment. Like, where am I doing business and who am I going to do business with? How well do I know them? etc. What's the law there? What's the nature of my relationship? So probably if you're going to do business with a UK company in the UK, and let's say they're a law firm, you probably don't have to worry about them engaging in too much risky behavior. But if you're going to be selling something, into Nigeria, for example, and you want to sell to the Nigerian government, that's a country with a very high probability of corruption. So you'll need to do more due diligence on your business partner and your customers in Nigeria. And if you're selling a product, you got to be more careful around export controls. So that's what you need to think about. Like, what's the risk of where I'm selling my stuff and where I'm doing business? Have a compliance program within your company. Make sure your leadership understands these types of risks. Make sure you do a risk assessment. Where do I want to sell? Do I want to sell into really risky countries where there's a lot of corruption and there's no export and there's a lot of people who are sanctioned, or companies who are sanctioned, like Russia, for example? There's tons of companies and persons right now sanctioned in Russia. Tons of their banks are sanctioned. So that's a very high risk place to do business. But if you want to go sell into Spain, then it's less risk. So that's what I mean by a risk assessment. Make sure you have policies and procedures that outline how you're going to do these things. Make sure the people that work for you and on your team understand what to do through training. Then audit, are you doing things the right way? And if you have questions or concerns, encourage all of your employees to go ahead and ask questions. If you have questions or concerns, go to the SBA, go to these agencies, state and commerce. But remember, they're regulating you, right? They'll help you, they'll guide you, but you got to be careful if you think you've done something wrong. It's probably a good idea to talk to a lawyer. And then if something has gone wrong, take corrective actions. And sometimes you even have to disclose, or it might be prudent to disclose to an agency that you might have done something wrong. Your contracts are a vital tool to use, you guys. Put in your contracts representations that your business partner's not going to engage in corrupt or fraudulent behavior. Make them disclose to you, do they have relationships with government officials? And if so, what are those? Make them certify that they're not going to improperly give gifts, meals, or entertainment or favors to government officials. Ask them whether they have a code of conduct and whether they engage in ethical behavior. And those sorts of things, putting them in your contract will be helpful. Make sure that you have a right to audit them, because you want to see if they're using their finances for something improper. Finally, foreign control and ownership and interest. If you're a defense contractor and you are a classified defense contractor, if you're going to have any foreign touch points, remember, you got to tell the Defense Counterintelligence Agency. That's a lot of other stuff behind that, but you got to make sure any foreign touch points, if you're a classified contractor, you got to work with the DCSA about it. Foreign investment. In the United States, we have this thing called CFIUS. It's gotten famous. CFIUS stands for Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. It became famous because TikTok, remember, like you heard CFIUS in TikTok, and then you heard CFIUS was involved in whether a Japanese company could buy US steel. CFIUS is all about trying to protect US technology, our US infrastructure, and our US data. So if you have export controlled or other innovative technology, you have the data of a lot of US persons, their birthdays, their social security numbers, their addresses, or if you're involved in US infrastructure, something your offices are right near an electrical plant, or you help run electrical plants, anything to do with technology, infrastructure, or data, you're that type of a business, and a foreign entity wants to invest in you or try to control you or purchase you, you're going to have to go ask the Committee on Foreign Investment if it's going to be an okay transaction. Finally, record keeping. You want to keep records of all of these types of transactions that you have in play, and that you could support why you made the decisions that you made to do what you did. And sometimes you'll have to put together a technology control plan as part of your records to show how you're going to make sure that your technology, that your items, your defense controlled items are not in fact getting any exposure to a non-US person. Importing, you got to check on that, make sure you do that right. Also, if you're going to export, you got to make sure maybe there's other agencies that have something to say about what you're exporting. And then make sure always to protect your intellectual property. And that is it. That is a wrap. Thank you all so very much. As I said, Stephen shared resources. The VA is a great resources to get you guys to places. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Curtis.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for your attendance. Thank you, Margaret, and thank you, Stephen. This was wonderful. Really appreciate your time and your effort and your expertise. This was great. Just want to let everybody know at the end of this, you will have of logging off, you will be given a survey. Please let us know how we did today. If you are a veteran-owned small business or a service-disabled veteran-owned small business, you certified. If you look in the socioeconomic category right now, how we had the surveys, it still say VA, SDV, or SB. If you have been certified by the SBA, just continuously click on the one you are identified with on the survey. So it's not an actual misprint. It's just something that we will have to change in the future. So if you have any questions or anything, please feel free to reach out to us. There's Margaret information there. I did have some registration already for the webinar, and on January the 16th, Stephen, that's coming in. You will receive a copy of the webinar and the recording tomorrow at 9 a.m. where that's located. And I also will add that slide deck somehow back to the slide deck for the QR code and registration for Stephen's January the 16th webinar. So I look forward to doing this again. Thank everybody once again. I hope everybody has a wonderful day.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.